Please feel free to raise your hand. As you do, somebody will rush with a microphone and you will get a chance to ask a question. So just in order for you to collect your thoughts and think about a question, maybe I will start by asking a question to the panel. We have in various ways heard you talk about the challenge of getting white people to be sort of interested and involved and committed to defense and to what it represents. What do you see as the main obstacle in the next 5 years' time to really getting the young people on board for this particular challenge? Minister, perhaps we'll start with you.
Pascal, I think the main challenge is reputation. There isn't a culture in Australia that the defence industry will provide jobs in STEM careers because of the stop-start nature of our defence industry contracts over many decades. So convincing parents, grandparents and their children and grandchildren that it's worth looking at defence industry as a lifelong career as opposed to a contract by contract or project by project job is the main obstacle. It's one of the reasons that the government created the workforce behind the Defence Force campaign, $20 million in two periods. The first one finished in December, the second one started in February and is still going. It's a substantial amount of money and it's designed to convince people that the defence industry is a big project for the future, so that young people thinking about science, technology, engineering and maths think, as Peter pointed out, if I do that, I'll get a job in Adelaide or Australia. I won't have to go to Europe or North America. But I think that reputational damage of governments not having the structure, the architecture that we now have, as I outlined in my speech, from the white paper through to the most recent Defence Industrial Capability Plan. So there wasn't a structure for people to look for to see that the government had a plan, and there wasn't the funds for things like a continuous naval ship build. So we've now appropriated the money for the next 10 years, a $200 billion military capability build-up. So I think young people now will think that they have a career in defence industry for life. We still have to overcome the valley of death that was created by the previous government, and we've done that. We've bridged that valley through a number of methods, but that's still a hangover to people because that would damage the reputation. Young people would be thinking, well, it's happened before, so will the government actually follow through? So one of the reasons we're making as many decisions as we can and putting that structure in place is to try and convince people that there is a generational change in the way we're thinking about defence industry.
Thank you. Visibility and uncertainty. Gabby, did you want to add something?
Sure. Is that on? I agree with you, Minister. One of the challenges that we have in our business now, and I think it's not just BAE Systems Australia, it's across defence industry, is we don't tell our story enough. We don't market defence industry enough. We create some brilliant technologies here in Australia. We've got some fabulous stories and we don't tell that story. So young people don't know. So the work that we're doing now, working with universities and TAFEs to get them to understand the brilliant careers they can have working in defence industry is really important. You know, John is a great example of, you know, a collaboration between defence industry, DST group and defence, where this is a magnificent Australian design, and you know, it is cutting edge technology. There's opportunities for us for export, and these are the things that we need to tell young people. You know, to know that you can work on these sorts of amazing technologies, that's how you'll get them in. That's what we've got to do. We've got to tell our story better. We've got to market.
Thank you, Gabby. Peter?
I think both of the speakers are right. I think when young Australians think about defence, they think about servicemen. They think about being told what to do and following orders. But in fact, the industries that we're talking about here are creative industries. There's a real opportunity for expression, a real opportunity for really meaningful lives, which are not to do with following orders and perhaps exactly the opposite. My sense, I think it was Bob Hawke that said, people are generally more sensible than you give them credit for. We are seeing pretty strong demand for our engineering programs at the moment, and my guess is that the message is starting to get through, and that what we're seeing there is a realisation that the jobs that are here are real and the jobs that are here are very good, and that that's translating into different student destination choices at tertiary level.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the additional point, there's what we're asking these new entrants to do, but there's also this dimension of how we work. And I suspect that a lot of the attraction of Google is not, well, is a part of, you know, how they go about their work, the agility, the challenge, the nature of the everyday engagement with the employer and with the market. And I worry that sometimes we haven't quite dealt with that, in the sense that maybe Industry 4.0 and those sorts of agenda give us some material to work with. But how do we create an energising, exciting offer that can at least sit beside a Google? That's the question I'd have in my mind.
Thank you, Bernard. I think we have our first question from the floor. Yes, Patrick.
Thank you, Pascal. Patrick Canning, Canning Insights. If I first made just a quick ad-lib response to what's just been said, as close as comes to representing young people in the room, one of the things that I'd say is that I have a perception, and I think that's shared by peers, that defence is one of those I'm a defence person or not. And as the gig economy becomes a more real aspect of the way that we work, and people are looking for flexible involvement in organisations and industries, I suggest that defence has an opportunity to make itself more available to those people who may not have a defence background to do some of their work in the industry rather than necessarily all of it. That aside, Christopher Pine, thank you very much for joining us. My question actually comes from your earlier speech, and I was interested, you talked a lot about the amount of Australian and South Australian content that will be in the available spend. And I'm just wondering if you have any techniques or strategies to ensure that that spend is genuinely value add created in the country, rather than imports being filtered through shell companies, for want of a better word, that might have an Australian ABN, to ensure that we really do grab all of the value that Mike sort of mentioned and Peter mentioned in generating economies past the defence spend.
Well, if you look at the Defence Industrial Capability Plan, you'll see that there are clear strategies for it to ensure that the Australian industry content is not simply to companies with an ABN in Australia, and we have managed to work out the difference between genuine Australian industry content and filtering through shelf companies. The definition of a local build is anything above 50%. The Collins-class submarine is now at about 82%. The Australian warfare destroyers was over 50%. We anticipate the OPVs and the future frigates to be 60%. It's up to companies to grasp the opportunities that are available and to approach the primes and not expect the primes to sort of turn up at their door with a lovely big bow and a gift and say, here we are, we want you to be part of our enterprise. If you want to be in the defence industry and take advantage of these enormous projects, you really need to be very forward-leaning. But through our defence industry policy statement, the setting up of the CEDA here in Adelaide, the increasing the skills of the Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group, headed by Kim Gillis, I think we have got the strategies in place to ensure that we are maximising the opportunities, and that will be shown up, of course, through various entirely independent methods, which will be like the Performance of Manufacturing Index, which has just entered its 19-month of continuous expansion, which is the longest since 2005, and March 2018 was the highest expansion on record of the Performance of Manufacturing Index. And for the first time in living memory, a defence industry has shown up in the last two national accounts as being one of the drivers of investments in the economy. So obviously somebody thinks that they're getting contracts in the defence industry. So perhaps you should contact the CDIC and see how you might become part of that story.
Well, maybe just it's one of these odd things, isn't it? If you look at the DICP, it'll tell you that 85% of the businesses that operate in the defence sector do so 1 day a week. Mm-hmm. Very few of us are dedicated, if you like, to defence. It's more often the story that you have a business that sits across multiple sectors. How do we get that message into the market? How do we bring some of the different thinking that might be in those adjacent sectors into defence and vice versa? These are, I think, the challenges that are on the table for us.
Thank you. I think we have a question over there. Thank
Hello.
you. Margot.
Margot Forster from the Defence Teaming Centre. My question is directed towards Mike. I really liked your comment about the need to change the risk appetite in defence. And I agree with you. I think the challenge is that we've set defence up such that the people who are responsible for acquisition are separate from those who actually deploy and fight the capability that we get for them. And what that causes is the person or the organisation who accepts the risk for a different way of acquiring a capability is separate from that organisation that will benefit the most from innovation and I understand how that has occurred. When many years ago, when each of the three services had their own capability acquisition organisation, some of the acquisition strategies might not have been, particularly robust, but the organisation that took the risk of the purchase were the ones that achieved the gain of the capability. And I'm wondering whether there might be some benefit in bringing those two organisations more closely together, so you don't have a separate organisation that gains from the risk and another that basically just has to deal with a purchase that goes wrong and deals with the risk.
Thank you, Margot. So sometimes changing wire diagrams it does affect culture, but I'm not sure. I think in this case I'd be more inspired by something that I see with a fellow called Lieutenant Colonel Kieran Joyce. I don't know if anyone follows him on Twitter, but if you don't, you should. He's a relatively mid-ranking fellow in the Army who has created incredible energy around autonomous flying systems. And I don't think there's any coincidence that the Minister to my left has been announcing a number of grants to these sorts of businesses is because a relatively junior person has created change in his organisation through his personal purpose. So I would offer maybe we need to give different people, more junior people, empower them to make some decisions around some of these opportunities that might have been carved off by a 2-star or a 3-star who has decided that in his or her experience that is too risky. I think there are people in the organisation without moving wire diagrams and creating new reviews who could quite easily change the risk appetite. My thoughts, I don't know what other people on the panel think.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah.
So Margot, I've been the end user. I've worked in the acquisition in what used to be called the DMO. And now I'm someone who provides capability to defence. The risk has to be shared across the enterprise, but from my personal experience, it's incumbent upon defence industry to ensure that we are engaging at the right levels within defence. So on large complex acquisitions, yes, we're going to work with the capability group, but we also need to be involved daily with the operator. And I do think that the capability group now understands that and gets that, and we do have that interface with the operator. Could it be better? Sure. But, defence, and I'm sure there's many of you in the room here who engage with the customer at various levels. So, if you've got an amazing piece of technology that you want to introduce to the Defence Force, then, you have a strategy with which to do that. And in order to validate your piece of technology, you need to talk to operators. So, and I think defence industry is doing that.
I think we have time for one last question at this end.
Thank you. James Blackburn, PwC and Chair of the Committee for Adelaide. Peter, your opening speech was fantastic. I think you nailed it in terms of what the opportunity is that we can do in South Australia around building an ecosystem that comes out of the ORA site. And certainly I personally share your views around, I think there's an obligation on all of us here to create a future for our children whereby they can choose whether or not to be in South Australia or they move on to other opportunities elsewhere. The ORA site obviously is in the hands of the state government at the moment. What have we got to do as a community, as a business community, but also universities and government to get together and actually create something, as opposed to, if I could pardon the pun, navel-gazing and just wondering what's going to happen?
Well, the expert on political judgment is sitting further to my left here, and Minister Pine might have a go at this after me. I think the first thing is to have respect for the fact that the current state government has made some commitments about that site and that they'll need to see those delivered. They don't necessarily hamstring the site in terms of the future that we think we can see. I'm a great believer that in democracies the power sits with the people rather than with the politicians, and that any enterprise that takes the time to really work through with, in this case, the citizens of South Australia or the citizens of Adelaide, to really work out whether this is the best use for that site, whether it really can make a difference to the future of the state and the future of our young people. That's where I think the power of the conversation will lie. It won't come from university preaching. It won't come from politicians just deciding. It will come from a state-based view that we want a different future and that this is the best way of grasping it. Whether there's a role for an organisation like the Committee of Adelaide, which I don't yet understand terribly well, to catalyse a conversation of that nature is really quite an interesting question. But as I say, I'm no expert in this area and I'm new to South Australia, so I'm not yet quite sure how one goes about brokering a conversation of that kind.
Would anybody want to add to this?
Sure. The ORA site is owned by the state government, and the state government has policies and plans for the ORA site. It is not owned by the University of Adelaide, nor any other university. The Australian government is not navel-gazing, and nobody in my orbit is a navel-gazer. The decisions that we're making in future frigates, combat reconnaissance vehicles, offshore patrol vessels, Pacific patrol boats, the upgrade of the Jawn system, ballistic missile defence shields, the battle management system, all of them have been on time in the last year and 10 months, so I don't think anybody could accuse us of not getting on and making decisions. The investments that we're making in defence in South Australia are largely across the arc of Osborne to Edinburgh. There's obviously very significant investments in Mawson Lakes, Osborne obviously, with the shipyard and the submarine yard, both of which will be larger than the Adelaide Oval Stadium, and the Edinburgh Air Base, which is becoming one of the most important assets in the Australian Defence Force, particularly, of course, based around surveillance and reconnaissance. So we're getting on with the job. What the state government decides to do with the ORA site is a matter for the state government. They announced policies before the last state election. I expect that they'll implement them. If the federal government can assist them through, for example, the location of the Defence Science and Technology Group assets that we already have in this state, of course we will talk to them. But I think it's wise for governments to get on and make decisions as opposed to be stopped constantly by new ideas which stop the momentum of decision making.
Okay, well, talking about time, I am the timekeeper and therefore will bring this conversation to a close, but I think you'll all agree that we've been privy to some various views as to the fantastic opportunity. So will you please thank the panel and join me in thanking them again.